What do you think happens behind the closed doors of the rich and powerful? Have you ever wondered what secrets might burn away in a fire? Secrets people would rather take to the grave? This story will leave you questioning everything. Chapter 1. The fire that drew me in. The heat was unbearable. It wasn't just the kind of warmth you feel on a summer day. It was oppressive, choking, as if the entire air around us had turned to liquid fire. Even with the gear protecting most of my body, I could feel it creeping in through the seams, threatening to scorch my skin if I stayed too long. Flames licked the sky, orange and red twisting together like a serpent determined to devour everything in its path. And the noise? It was chaos. Crackling flames, groaning wood giving way, and the distant sound of collapsing structures created a symphony of destruction. Through all of it, the panicked shouts of my team cut through like jagged glass. Every order, every call for backup was filled with an edge of desperation. The palisade fire wasn't like anything I'd dealt with before. Fires were never predictable, but this one felt alive, angry even. We'd been called to all kinds of emergencies, from small house fires to wild infernos, but the scale of this one rattled even the most seasoned among us. It wasn't just the sheer size of it, though that was intimidating enough. It was where it was happening. This wasn't some ordinary neighborhood. These hills were home to celebrities, CEOs, people whose lives were shielded by money and power, and as I stared up at the towering flames climbing toward the sky, I couldn't help but wonder what secrets those mansions held. Secrets the fire was now threatening to consume. Our orders were clear: protect what we could, evacuate anyone still inside, and do it fast. But as we got closer to one of the larger estates, a sprawling property perched high above the chaos, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fire. This house wasn't just another mansion. It belonged to Sean Diddy Combs, a man whose name alone carried more weight than most. The closer we got, the stranger things became. For starters, the security cameras lining the property were still operational. That was odd, considering the fire had taken out power lines across the area. Most of the houses around here were dark, save for the glow of the flames. But those cameras? They tracked us as we approached, little red lights blinking like eyes in the night. It wasn't just unsettling, it felt wrong. Why would a system like that still be working when the rest of the grid was down? Then there were the people. Staff members, maybe security, were running around the perimeter, shouting at each other in what seemed like a mix of panic and code. I couldn't make out all their words, but what I did hear raised more questions than answers. "Not there!" one of them yelled. "Get it out of the basement!" Another shouted something about locking doors, though the exact phrasing was lost in the noise. Some even cried. He wasn't the only one who'd had his earpiece sniffed. The boys who had scurried away made the squeaking sounds, as if none of them seemed concerned about us, the firefighters who had just arrived to help. In fact, they looked almost annoyed by our presence, as if we were intruding on something we weren't meant to see. When we tried to approach the house, things got even stranger. A man in a dark suit, not exactly the type you'd expect to see during an evacuation, stepped in front of us, arms outstretched, like he thought he could physically stop a team of firefighters armed with hoses and axes. "You can't go in there," he said, his voice calm but firm. I thought maybe he hadn't understood the situation, so I started to explain. "Sir, the house is at risk. We need to make sure no one's inside and secure the—" He cut me off with a sharp shake of his head. "You have no jurisdiction here." No jurisdiction. I've heard a lot of things on the job, but that one took the cake. I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was serious. Behind him, more staff members were moving frantically, some carrying what looked like boxes, others just standing around as if waiting for instructions. One of my team members muttered under his breath, "This guy's out of his mind." I couldn't have agreed more. We were wasting time arguing, and every second mattered. The fire wasn't waiting for anyone, and neither were we. Pushing past the man, we made our way toward the entrance, only to find the doors locked. Not just locked, They were reinforced, like something out of a high-security facility. It took more than a few swings of an axe to break through, but when we did, the heat that poured out was like stepping into an oven. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning wood, but that wasn't what made me stop in my tracks. It was the sound, faint at first, almost swallowed by the chaos around us, but unmistakable once you heard it. Screams, high-pitched, bone-chilling screams that didn't sound like they came from someone trying to escape a fire. They sounded trapped. Terrified, my stomach twisted as I looked at my team, their faces mirroring the same unease I felt. "Did you hear that?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. They nodded, their eyes scanning the smoke-filled hallway ahead. The screams came again, louder this time, echoing off the walls. Whoever it was, they were deeper inside the house. We exchanged a glance, unspoken but understood. We had to go in, protocol or no protocol. We couldn't ignore this. As we moved further into the mansion, the details only got stranger. Luxury furnishings were scattered and scorched, as if someone had been in a hurry to leave, but not before taking what they could. Walls lined with expensive art were smeared with soot, yet some pieces looked like they'd been deliberately removed. And all the while, the security cameras inside the house blinked down at us, silent witnesses to whatever had happened here. At this point, the screams grew louder as we approached what looked like a staircase leading down. A basement. My heart pounded in my chest as we prepared to descend, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But it wasn't fear of the fire or even the unknown that made me hesitate. It was the feeling that whatever we were about to find would change. And then, just as we reached the top of the stairs, the screaming stopped. Chapter 2. Entering the Mansion of Secrets. The screams refused to leave my mind, even as the flames crackled and my team worked to control the fire. Those haunting cries felt like they were etched into my brain. I knew the protocol: secure the scene, contain the blaze, and ensure the house was clear of people. But those screams weren't protocol. They were a demand for action, for answers. They clawed at me, pulling me deeper into a conflict I wasn't ready for. "Focus on the job," I told myself, trying to drown out the growing unease. The marshal's voice boomed through the radio, commanding us to sweep the mansion for anyone trapped. My team and I exchanged nods, but my mind wasn't entirely on the task at hand. Something about this place felt wrong. The screams, the guarded staff, the lingering sense that this fire was hiding more than just destruction. It was all impossible to ignore. We stepped through the charred entrance, and the full weight of the mansion's opulence hit me. Even with smoke curling through the air, the wealth on display was overwhelming. Gold-plated door frames reflected the flickering light of the fire, and despite the soot clinging to every surface, they gleamed as if untouched by the chaos. Crystal chandeliers hung precariously from the ceiling, their brilliance dimmed but not extinguished. The sheer grandeur of it all felt suffocating. A place like this could fund our entire department for a year, one of my crewmates muttered, his voice dripping with disbelief. But it wasn't just the wealth that made the mansion unsettling. It was the way it seemed almost prepared for something like this. The gold-plated doors weren't just decorative, they were reinforced, heavy enough to resist even the strongest flames. Heat-resistant safes were scattered in plain view, as if someone had been in a rush to prioritize what needed saving. Then there was the staff. Their behavior made my skin crawl. Unlike the panicked chaos you'd expect from people fleeing a fire, they moved with precision, almost like they had rehearsed this exact scenario. 2 men carried a fireproof safe between them, their faces grim and determined. Others darted through the smoke with armfuls of documents and boxes, their urgency tinged with something more than fear. "What the hell are they doing?" I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. One woman stopped just long enough to lock a door behind her before vanishing into the haze. It wasn't panic, it was control. Every movement, every action felt like part of a larger plan. My unease deepened with every step. As we moved further into the mansion, the air grew heavier. The smell of burning wood mixed with something metallic, sharp enough to sting my nose. My boots crunched against debris, shattered glass, fragments of furniture, and unrecognizable objects reduced to ash. Each step echoed ominously through the cavernous halls, amplifying the eerie silence that hung in the air. We split up to cover more ground, and I found myself alone in a long, dimly lit corridor. Portraits lined the walls, each one larger than life. They depicted stern-faced men in tailored suits, their eyes seeming to follow me as I walked. It felt like they were watching, judging, as if I had no right to be here. At the end of the hall, I found the first room. The door was ajar, hanging loosely on its hinges, as if it had been forced open in a hurry. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the haze. The destruction was nearly total. Furniture reduced to piles of ash, walls blackened with soot. But amid the ruins there were fragments that didn't belong. Burnt photographs littered the floor, their edges curled and charred. I crouched down, picking up the largest piece I could find. Most of the image was blurred, the fire having eaten away at the details, but what remained sent a chill down my spine. It was a party. Young people, barely out of their teens, stood in glittering outfits, posing in front of what looked like the very mansion I was standing in. A purplish face looked down at me, but went farther. I was left spectating. The mansion looked like a temple, but their faces, they didn't look happy, they looked terrified. I set the photo down, my hands trembling. Around me, papers were scattered everywhere. Some were half-burned, others intact enough to read. One caught my eye, a crumpled page with the words "guest list" scrawled across the top. My stomach dropped as I scanned the names. Celebrities, politicians, people with power and influence, names that didn't belong together on the same list. The implications hit me like a punch to the gut. Before I could process what I'd found, a noise snapped me out of my thoughts. It was faint at first, a soft thud that seemed to come from beneath the floor. I froze, straining to listen. There it was again, a rhythmic, almost deliberate sound. It was coming from below. I followed the noise down the hall, past more locked doors and untouched furniture. The deeper I went, the stranger the mansion felt. This wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. Every door was reinforced, every window barred or covered with heavy drapes. It was designed to keep people out, or in. Finally, I reached the source of the noise. A large metal door loomed at the end of the hallway, its surface covered in soot but otherwise untouched by the fire. It had no handle, just a keypad and a small speaker mounted beside it. I pressed my ear against the cold metal. The thudding was louder now, joined by muffled voices. "Hey," I called out, banging on the door with my fist. "Is someone in there?" No response, just more muffled sounds. My heart raced as I turned to call for backup, but something on the wall nearby caught my eye. It was a small alcove, almost hidden in the shadows, holding what looked like a diary. Its leather cover was charred at the edges, the pages warped from heat. I grabbed it, flipping it open to reveal hurried, disjointed handwriting. The entries were fragmented, each one more chilling than the last. "Too many guests, keep them quiet, don't let anyone upstairs." The words seemed to blur together, their meanings sinking into my chest like a weight. I flipped to the last page and felt my blood run cold. It was just one sentence, scrawled in jagged, frantic letters. "What burns away cannot speak." A shiver ran down my spine. Whatever was behind that door, whatever had been happening in this house, it wasn't something I was supposed to see. But I couldn't turn back. Not yet. Chapter 3. The Screams That Won't Stop. The screams grew louder as we moved deeper into the mansion, cutting through the roar of the fire and the crunch of debris underfoot. They were sharper now, more distinct, like they were coming from just ahead. My flashlight danced across the smoke-filled hallways, illuminating twisted remnants of the luxury this house once boasted. The flickering beams of light from my team's gear carved into the darkness. But nothing we saw could explain those screams, or the growing unease gnawing at me. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was thickening with something far more sinister than smoke. The house groaned under the weight of the fire, beams above creaking as if ready to give way. But it wasn't the structure threatening to collapse that made my stomach churn. It was the sound. Those cries didn't belong in this world. They weren't just screams of panic or fear. They were something deeper, something primal, as if they were being dragged from the depths of someone's soul. "This way," I called out, trying to steady my voice. My crew followed, their faces masked with determination and dread. One of them, Jackson, paused for a moment and turned to me. "You hear that?" he asked, though we both already knew the answer. His eyes darted around nervously, like he was hoping someone would say it was just a trick of the fire, an echo of something explainable. But no one did. We followed the screams down a long corridor, the walls lined with blackened portraits and gilded mirrors cracked from the heat. The further we went, the less it felt like we were in a house. The opulence was still there, ornate molding, crystal chandeliers, but something about it felt off, like it was a facade hiding something darker. The screams seemed to pulse, growing louder with each step. Then, just as we thought we'd found the source, they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. It was like the mansion itself had been holding its breath, and now it waited for us to make the next move. I froze, my flashlight scanning the hallway ahead. That's when I saw it, a door partially hidden behind a tapestry, the edges of it blackened by smoke. It was heavy, reinforced, and locked tight. My gut told me that whatever was behind that door was the reason for everything. The screams, the strange behavior of the staff, the fire itself. "We need to get this open," I said, my voice firm but low. Before anyone could respond, the quiet was shattered by the sound of hurried footsteps. One of Diddy's staff appeared out of the smoke, his face red and glistening with sweat. He looked frantic, but his eyes were locked on us with a desperation I couldn't place. "You can't go in there," he yelled, stumbling toward us. "You don't know what you're doing. You're making a huge mistake." "Stop back," Jackson barked, stepping between us and the man. "We're firefighters. We don't have time for this." The man's face twisted in frustration. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "If you open that door, you'll ruin everything." I didn't have time to argue. "Get him out of here," I ordered, and two of my team grabbed the man, pulling him back despite his protests. His shouting echoed down the hallway as he was dragged away, but I couldn't focus on him anymore. My attention was locked on the door. Whatever was behind it, I needed to know. It took all of us to break through. Axes and crowbars slammed against the reinforced wood, the sound of splintering material barely audible over the fire raging around us. When the door finally gave way, it revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up from below was cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach turn. I felt Jackson's hand on my shoulder. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. "No," I admitted, but I started down the stairs anyway. The screams didn't return, but the silence was worse. Each step echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing off the stone walls like a warning. The basement was nothing like the mansion above. It wasn't designed for luxury. It was a place meant to be hidden, forgotten. The walls were rough, unpainted concrete, and the floor was bare. My flashlight illuminated bits and pieces of what remained. A charred chair, the remnants of wires, and a scorched camera lying in the corner. It didn't take long to realize what this place was. The restraints bolted to the walls, the heavy chains lying in a pile on the floor, the remnants of video equipment. All of it painted a horrifying picture. This wasn't just a basement. It was a place where people had been held, filmed, and I couldn't finish the thought. My stomach twisted in knots, bile rising in my throat. My team moved around me, their own flashlights revealing more horrors. Scraps of burnt fabric, overturned tables, and blackened remnants of what looked like tapes. "This isn't just a fire," Jackson said, his voice shaking. This is a crime scene." I nodded, though I didn't trust myself to speak. My eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room, where a metal filing cabinet stood partially open. Inside were folders and notebooks, many of them too damaged to read, but one caught my attention. It was small, bound in leather, its edges charred, but the pages mostly intact. I opened it, the smell of smoke and aged paper filling my nose. The entries were written in a rushed, frantic hand. Most of them were short, cryptic phrases that only deepened the sense of dread. "Keep them quiet. Too much footage. Burn it all. No witnesses." My hands trembled as I turned the pages, each entry more disturbing than the last. Then I reached the final page. "What happens in the fire stays in the fire." The words were written in bold, jagged letters, etched into the paper as if whoever wrote them had been desperate to make them permanent. I stared at the phrase, my mind racing. This wasn't just a house fire, it was a cover-up. Someone wanted whatever happened here to disappear, and they were willing to destroy everything to make that happen. My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise behind me, a soft creak, like a door opening. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the shadows cast by the flickering flames above. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to my team. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But even as I said it, I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without answers. Chapter 4: The Hidden Room. The air in the basement felt heavier the deeper we went, the kind of suffocating weight that pressed on your chest and turned every breath into a chore. The fire raged above us, but down here the silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our footsteps against the concrete floor and the faint crackle of flames echoing from the stairwell. My flashlight swept across the walls, revealing scorch marks and shadows that seemed to twist and writhe in the corners of my vision. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting to see what we'd find next. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt like we were intruding on something that was never meant to be uncovered. There was a sense of finality in the air, a deep-rooted knowledge that whatever we found down here would leave scars we'd never shake. And then I saw it. Another door, tucked into the farthest corner of the basement. Unlike the others, this one wasn't charred or damaged. It was pristine, untouched by the fire, as if it had been designed to withstand whatever destruction rained down above. "Over here," I called out, my voice hoarse. My team turned toward me, their flashlights converging on the door. It was made of heavy steel, the kind you'd expect to see in a bank vault, not in someone's basement. A small keypad was embedded beside it, the numbers glowing faintly in the dim light. "What kind of basement is this?" Jackson muttered, his tone laced with unease. I didn't answer. Instead, I stepped closer, running my gloved hand over the cool surface of the door. There was no handle, no visible way to open it other than the keypad. My gut told me that whatever was behind this door was the reason for the fire, the reason for the screams, the reason for everything. "We need to get this open," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. It wasn't easy. Breaking through the reinforced steel took time we didn't have, but we didn't stop. The fire could spread, the structure could collapse, and the risks didn't seem to matter anymore. Every strike of the axe, every heave of the crowbar, felt like we were chipping away at some great, hidden truth. The door finally gave way with a groan of metal, swinging open to reveal a room unlike anything we'd seen so far. It was pristine, untouched by fire, untouched by time. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, polished to a mirror-like shine. A massive rug covered the floor, its intricate patterns swirling together in a way that made my head spin if I stared too long. Luxury furniture was arranged with deliberate precision. Plush leather chairs, a mahogany desk, and a long glass display case that stretched across one wall. It looked more like a private study than a basement. But it wasn't the furniture that drew my attention. It was the decorations. Masks hung from the walls, each one more grotesque than the last. Some were carved from wood, others molded from metal, but all of them had an air of menace. Their hollow eyes seemed to watch us as we moved, their twisted expressions frozen in silent screams or mocking grins. In the center of the room stood a table, its surface covered in strange symbols that looked hand-carved into the wood. Candles, half melted and blackened, surrounded the edges of the table, their wax pooled onto the floor below. "This is insane," Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible. He was right. The room felt like something out of a nightmare, a place that didn't belong in the world above. My flashlight swept across the display case and my heart sank at what I saw. Inside were rows of passports, stacks of cash, bound with rubber bands and photographs. Dozens of photographs, some burnt around the edges but still horrifyingly clear. They showed people, young men and women, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and despair. Some were blindfolded, others gagged, and all of them looked like they were pleading for help through the camera lens. "What the hell is this place?" one of my team members asked, his voice trembling. No one answered. There were no words for what we were looking at. I moved toward the desk, drawn by a stack of papers sitting neatly in the center. The top sheet caught my eye immediately. It was a contract of some kind, filled with legal jargon I didn't fully understand, but one phrase stood out. Non-disclosure agreement. Penalty for breach, $10 million. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, each one detailing clauses and conditions that seemed designed to silence anyone who stepped foot in this room. "This isn't just a study," I said, my voice low. "This is a vault. A vault for secrets." Jackson joined me, his flashlight illuminating the rest of the desk. There were more documents, more contracts, but the thing that stopped both of us cold was a photograph lying face down beneath the stack. He picked it up, turning it over carefully, and we both froze. It was a picture of a girl, no older than 16, sitting in the very chair behind the desk. Her expression was blank, her eyes empty, but her hands were bound, her wrists red and raw. "Isn't right," Jackson whispered, his voice breaking. He placed the photo back down like it burned to hold it. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of this house, to seal the door behind us and forget we'd ever been here. But then I saw it. Another safe, smaller than the first, but just as impenetrable looking, tucked into a corner beneath the desk. Unlike the display case, this one was closed, its keypad blinking faintly. My gut told me it was important, that whatever was inside could blow this whole thing wide open, but opening it would mean crossing a line I wasn't sure I could cross. "Should we even touch this?" one of the guys asked, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. What were we supposed to do? Call it in? Report it to people who might already be complicit? My mind raced with the possibilities, each one more damning than the last. People like Diddy didn't go down easily. They had lawyers, connections, the kind of power that could erase entire lifetimes of wrongdoing with a single phone call. But could we just walk away? Could we leave this room knowing what we'd seen and let it all burn away like it was never here? My hands clenched into fists as I wrestled with the decision, my heart pounding in my chest. Before I could decide, a voice cut through the silence. "Oh my God." I turned to see one of my team members standing frozen near the edge of the room, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "What is it?" I asked, already dreading the answer. He didn't speak. He just pointed to the floor, his hand shaking. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Among the debris and ash scattered across the room was a single, unmistakable object. A charred bone. Human. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of the discovery hung in the air, suffocating us. This wasn't just a hidden room. It wasn't just a vault of secrets. It was a tomb. Chapter 5. The night that won't end. The moment we stepped out of the basement, it was like the fire had found a second wind. Flames roared through the walls above us, lighting up the night sky in shades of orange and red. The air was hotter, heavier, and filled with a dense, choking smoke that clung to our skin and lungs. My gear, already soaked with sweat, felt like it was suffocating me. The mansion groaned and creaked, the sound of wood and metal twisting under the heat, growing louder with each passing second. It was clear. We didn't have much time before the structure gave in completely. "Out! Everyone out, now!" I shouted over the chaos, my voice barely carrying above the roar of the fire. My team didn't hesitate. We rushed up the stairs and back into the main floor, the haunting discoveries of the basement clinging to our minds, but overshadowed by the immediate danger. As we burst through the mansion's front doors, the scene outside hit me like a slap to the face. The chaos wasn't just contained to the fire anymore. It had spread beyond the property. Media crews had arrived, their cameras pointed at the mansion like vultures circling a fresh carcass. Reporters barked hurried updates into microphones, their words carried away by the crackling fire and the buzz of onlookers gathering behind the police barricades. "Get this under control," someone yelled near the trucks, their voice a mixture of panic and frustration. But the fire wasn't the only thing out of control. The energy outside was suffocating, the kind of frenetic tension that made your chest tighten and your instincts scream. I scanned the crowd as I caught my breath, noting how the bystanders weren't just curious. They were transfixed, as if they were waiting for something big to happen. Then there was Diddy's team. Even in the middle of the chaos, they were easy to spot. Suits that were too expensive for this kind of situation, crisp even in the haze of smoke and ash. A few of them stood near the barricades, talking rapidly into phones while gesturing toward the mansion. Their presence wasn't reassuring, it was calculated. They weren't here to help, they were here to control the narrative. "They're already spinning it," Jackson muttered, nodding toward the group. Sure enough, snippets of conversation floated through the noise, their tone polished and rehearsed. "Accidental electrical fire," one of them said. "Completely unforeseen." Another chimed in with a carefully placed comment about how quickly the fire department had responded, turning a crisis into a PR talking point. I clenched my jaw, my mind racing back to what we'd seen in the basement. This wasn't an accident. It couldn't be. Fires don't start themselves, and people don't keep hidden rooms full of horrors in their basements for no reason. My stomach churned as I watched the suits work the crowd, their calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos around. But it wasn't just the PR team that unsettled me. The staff members who had escaped the fire were scattered near the trucks, some sitting on the ground with blankets draped over their shoulders, others pacing in tight circles. None of them spoke. Not to us, not to the media, not even to each other. Their silence was eerie, like they'd been trained for this moment, like they knew better than to say a word. I walked past a small group of them, my eyes scanning their faces. Most avoided my gaze, their eyes fixed on the ground or staring blankly into the distance. But one woman, a middle-aged staff member clutching a soot-covered bag, caught my eye. Her hands trembled as she clutched the bag to her chest, her lips pressed into a thin, pale line. I wanted to ask her something, anything, but the words died in my throat. The look on her face told me all I needed to know. She was terrified, not of the fire, but of what might happen if she spoke. As I turned back toward the trucks, a cold chill ran down my spine. It wasn't the fire or the media or the staff that did it. It was the feeling of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one there. Still, the feeling didn't go away. My skin prickled, my instincts screaming that something wasn't right. "Huh?" I scanned the area again, slower this time. That's when I noticed them. Two men standing near one of the fire trucks, their faces partially obscured by the haze of smoke. They weren't firefighters. They weren't media either. Their clothes were too plain, their presence too deliberate. They weren't helping, weren't asking questions, weren't doing anything that made sense in the chaos. They were just standing there, watching. One of them caught me staring and turned slightly, saying something to the other before they both disappeared into the crowd. My heart raced, the weight of the night pressing harder on my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being monitored, that someone was making sure we didn't get too close to the truth. "Hey, you good?" Jackson's voice cut through my thoughts, grounding me for a moment. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. "I'm fine," I said, my voice tight. "Let's keep moving." We worked quickly to contain the fire, but my focus was split. Every shadow, every movement in the corner of my eye felt like a threat. My thoughts kept drifting back to the basement, to the charred photographs, the safe, the bone. The weight of it all felt unbearable, like I was carrying something I couldn't put down. As we finished securing the perimeter, I noticed the same staff member from earlier, the woman with the soot-covered bag, standing near the edge of the crowd. She was staring at me now, her eyes wide and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Desperation? It was hard to tell. She hesitated for a moment before taking a shaky step toward me. "You didn't see anything," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise around us. Her hands clutched the bag tighter as she leaned in closer. "For your own sake, leave it alone." Before I could respond, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, her words hanging in the air like a ghost. My mind raced, the pieces of the night swirling together in a chaotic blur. The fire, the basement, the suits, the men near the trucks, it was all connected, but I didn't know how. All I knew was that we weren't just fighting a fire tonight. We were caught in something far bigger, something far darker. As the flames began to die down and the chaos subsided, I couldn't shake the woman's words. "Leave it alone." The thought lingered, clawing at the edges of my mind as we packed up our gear and prepared to leave. But how could I leave it alone? How could anyone, after what we'd seen? The night wasn't over. Not for me, not for any of us, and as I climbed into the truck, the weight of what we'd uncovered settled deep in my chest. I didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was certain. This night would haunt me forever. Chapter 6. After the fire. The fire was finally out. What had once been a sprawling mansion perched high above the Palisades was now a smoldering ruin, the skeleton of its former grandeur barely recognizable through the charred remains. The air was thick with smoke and ash, lingering long after the flames had been extinguished. My body ached from the effort of the night, every muscle screaming for rest. But my mind wouldn't let me stop. I couldn't stop replaying what I had seen. The basement, the photographs, the bone, and the screams. God, the screams. We stood outside, staring at the wreckage as the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon. The glow of sunlight did little to ease the tension in my chest. The team was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. No one spoke about the basement. No one mentioned the locked room, the masks, or the safe. It was like we'd all made an unspoken agreement to pretend it hadn't happened, to let the fire take the secrets with it. But I knew better. Fires consume a lot of things, but not memories, not guilt. The arrival of the authorities jolted me out of my daze. Police cars and black SUVs pulled up in rapid succession, their lights flashing against the ashen ruins. Men and women in suits stepped out, their expressions sharp and calculated. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here to manage the situation, to control it. One of the officers approached me, a clipboard in hand and a neutral expression plastered on his face. "We'll take it from here," he said, his tone flat. There was no gratitude, no acknowledgement of the hell we'd just been through, just a cold dismissal. I wanted to tell him everything, to unload the weight pressing down on my chest, but as I opened my mouth, something stopped me. It wasn't fear, at least not entirely. It was the way he looked at me, like he already knew what I wanted to say, like he was daring me to say it. Instead, I nodded and stepped back, letting them pass. My team and I watched as they moved through the ruins, their movements methodical and precise. It didn't take long to realize they weren't investigating. They were removing. Boxes were carried out, some half-burned, others intact, their contents hidden from view. I recognized a few of the items, the charred remnants of the safe, a stack of photographs that hadn't been completely destroyed. My stomach turned as I realized what was happening. They weren't here to uncover the truth. They were here to bury it. "You see that?" Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to tear my eyes away from the scene. It wasn't just the removal of evidence that struck me. It was the way they moved, like they'd done this before. Like this wasn't the first time they'd cleaned up a mess like this. Whispers started among the team, low and cautious. "Did you hear about the bribe?" one of them murmured. "Supposedly someone tried to slip the chief an envelope before we even got here." Another chimed in. "I heard it was 6 figures just to keep quiet." I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces fit too neatly. The resistance we'd faced from the staff, the PR team spinning their story, the hesitation from the authorities. It all pointed to one thing. Someone with power, someone like Diddy, was pulling the strings, making sure this fire left nothing behind but ashes. The weight of it all hit me hard. I felt like I was drowning, each revelation dragging me deeper into a sea of doubt and fear. I tried to push it down, to focus on the task of packing up our gear and clearing the scene, but it clung to me like a second skin. The images from the basement flashed in my mind every time I closed my eyes. The restraints, the photographs, the masks. All of it seared into my memory, impossible to forget. By the time I got home, exhaustion had taken over. I collapsed onto my couch, still in my gear, and stared at the ceiling, hoping for some kind of clarity. But instead of answers, I got nightmares. The screams were back, louder than ever, echoing through my dreams like a haunting melody I couldn't escape. The faces from the photographs stared at me, their expressions twisted in terror. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. The days that followed weren't any better. I tried to focus on my routine, to shake the feeling that I was being watched. But the paranoia was relentless. Every car that passed my house, every unfamiliar face on the street, it all felt like a threat. I couldn't shake the sense that someone, somewhere, was waiting for me to slip up, to say the wrong thing. And then the letter came. It was waiting for me on my doorstep one morning, tucked neatly under the welcome mat. There was no return address, no name, just a plain white envelope that felt heavier than it should. My hands shook as I opened it, pulling out a single sheet of paper and a stack of photographs. The photos stopped me cold. They were the same ones I'd seen in the basement. The faces, the fear, the evidence. My stomach churned as I flipped through them, each image a brutal reminder of what we'd found. But it was the note that made my blood run cold. It was short, just a few words scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Speak, and you'll regret it." I dropped the paper as if it had burned me, my mind racing. Someone knew, someone had been watching, had seen what we'd found and what we'd done. The warning was clear, but it left me with more questions than answers. Who had sent it? Why give me the photos if they wanted me to stay silent? Was it a threat or a test? Victor, I sat there, the letter and photos spread out on the table in front of me, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Stay silent and let it go, like they wanted, or risk everything to expose the truth, knowing the odds were stacked against me. The screams echoed in my mind, a reminder of the horrors we'd uncovered. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 7. A System Protecting Itself. The realization hit me like a gut punch. The system wasn't just broken, it was designed to fail people like me. People who wanted answers, who wanted accountability. After days of sitting on the letter and photos, I decided I couldn't stay silent. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than just one fire or one basement full of horrors. It was a web of lies, secrecy, and power, and it wasn't going to unravel on its own. I started small, reaching out to my captain under the guise of a follow-up report on the fire. I knew I had to tread carefully. The weight of what I'd seen wasn't something I could just dump on someone without proof, and even with the photos I'd received, I wasn't sure I trusted anyone enough to show them yet. Still, I tested the waters. A fire at the mansion, I began, trying to keep my tone neutral. Something felt off. Did anyone else notice how fast the authorities shut it down, like they weren't interested in investigating? My captain looked up from his desk, his expression carefully unreadable. "Fires like that draw attention," he said finally. "High-profile places, celebrities involved. People want to sweep it under the rug and move on. It's not our place to ask questions." "But what if there's more to it?" I pressed, my voice dipping into a whisper. What if it wasn't just a fire? What if something was happening there? Something criminal? He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Let me give you some advice," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You did your job. You saved lives. That's where it ends for you. Don't go digging where you don't belong." The warning hung in the air like a threat. I nodded, forcing myself to back off, but my gut told me he knew more than he was letting on. Whether he was complicit or just trying to protect himself, I couldn't say. Either way, I was on my own. I turned to the media next, thinking the press might be willing to shine a light on what had happened. I reached out to a local journalist I'd worked with before, someone who had covered our department during past fires. At first, they seemed interested, asking questions about the fire and the unusual circumstances surrounding it. But then, something changed. A day after our initial call, I got a curt email. "Sorry, but I can't pursue this story further. Thanks for reaching out." No explanation, no follow-up. When I tried calling them, my calls went straight to voicemail. It didn't take long to figure out why. A quick search online revealed photos of the journalist leaving a high-end restaurant downtown, seated across from someone in a tailored suit, one of Diddy's representatives. They'd shut it down before it even started. The more I pushed, the harder it became to ignore the fact that I was being watched. At first, it was subtle. A black sedan parked a few houses down from mine, its engine idling for hours at a time. A man in a baseball cap lingering at the grocery store, his face turned just enough to avoid being recognized. But as the days passed, the surveillance grew bolder. The same sedan began following me on my way to work, staying just far enough back to avoid suspicion, but never letting me out of sight. One night I came home to find my front door slightly ajar. My stomach dropped as I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room for signs of what had happened. The place wasn't ransacked. There were no overturned furniture or shattered windows. But it was wrong. I could feel it. Drawers that I never used were open, their contents shifted slightly. A stack of papers on my desk had been rifled through, the edges curling where they'd been handled roughly. Whoever had been here wasn't looking for valuables. They were looking for something specific. I tore through the house, searching for anything they might have taken, but nothing was missing. Not the photos, not the letter. I'd hidden those well, and it seemed they hadn't found them. But the invasion left me shaken. Someone out there wanted to scare me, to remind me that I wasn't safe, and it was working. I tried to convince myself to stop, to let it go like my captain had suggested, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But the images from the basement wouldn't let me. They played on a loop in my mind, the restraints, the photos, the bone. And then there was the girl. Her face haunted me, even more than the screams. There was something in her eyes, something that begged for help. Even through the grainy, charred edges of the photograph, I couldn't let it go, not when people like her were at the center of this. Late one night, I pulled out the evidence I'd managed to hide from the fire. It was buried in an old toolbox in the garage, wrapped in layers of tape and plastic. My hands trembled as I peeled it open, the smell of smoke wafting up like a ghost. Inside was the photograph, the one I'd grabbed from the basement before everything had gone to hell. The image was damaged but still clear enough to make out. A young girl, no older than 16, stood frozen in front of an ornate fireplace. Her dress was glittering, her hair styled, but her expression betrayed her. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't happy, she was terrified. Her wide eyes stared directly into the camera, pleading silently for someone, anyone, to save her. Beside her, partially obscured by the damage to the photo, stood a man. His face was harder to make out, but there was no mistaking the silhouette, the tailored suit, the confident stance. It was Diddy. Standing next to her, his hand resting on her shoulder like he owned her. I stared at the photograph, my stomach twisting into knots. This wasn't just proof, it was a key, a thread that could unravel the entire web if I was willing to pull it. But pulling it meant risking everything, my career, my safety, my life. The letter's warning echoed in my mind. Speak, and you'll regret it. I placed the photo back in its hiding spot, my mind racing. The system wasn't just protecting itself. It was suffocating anyone who dared to challenge it. I didn't know who to trust, who to turn to, or how far they'd go to keep this quiet. But one thing was certain. I couldn't stop now, not after this. The girl's face burned in my memory, her silent plea more haunting than any scream. I didn't know what was coming next, but I could feel it. Whatever this was, it wasn't over, not yet. Chapter 8. The screams that still haunt me. Some nights the screams are louder than others. I'll be lying in bed, the house silent, and suddenly they'll be there. Faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind, but then they grow, sharp and piercing, until they drown out everything else. I wake up gasping for air, my heart pounding, the room spinning as I try to convince myself it's just a dream. But it never feels like just a dream. It feels real, like I'm still in that mansion, standing in the smoke and flames, hearing those cries echo through the halls. I've replayed that night 1,000 times in my head, dissecting every moment, every decision, every clue. It doesn't matter how much time passes, those images are burned into my memory. The hidden room, the charred photographs, the masks on the walls, the bone, and that girl. Her face, her eyes, the way she seemed to beg for help even through the grainy edges of a burned photograph. I can't forget it, no matter how hard I try. I wish I could say I've moved on, that I've found some kind of closure or peace, but the truth is, I haven't. How could I? The system is rigged. I saw it with my own eyes. The authorities who arrived at the scene weren't there to investigate, they were there to clean up. The media wasn't interested in the truth. They were silenced before they could even ask the right questions. And me? I'm just one person. A firefighter who stumbled onto something I was never supposed to see. What could I possibly do against a machine this big, this powerful? The paranoia never goes away. Every time I leave my house, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the street for unfamiliar cars or faces. Every knock at the door sends my heart racing. Every phone call from an unknown number leaves me wondering if this is it. If they've finally decided I'm a loose end that needs tying up. I've tried to tell myself to let it go, to move on and pretend it never happened. But it's not that simple. The weight of what I saw doesn't let you walk away. It follows you, clings to you like smoke from a fire that won't burn out. And then there are the photos. I've hidden them well, buried them in a place I hope no one will ever find. But knowing they're there, knowing the truth they hold, feels like carrying a ticking time bomb. Sometimes I wonder if keeping them was a mistake, if they'll end up being the thing that gets me killed. But then I think of that girl, of her terrified expression, her silent plea for help. I think of all the people like her, the ones who didn't have a chance to escape, who were silenced before their stories could be told. And I know I can't let it go. I can't let them win. The system is protecting people like Diddy, people who hide behind their wealth and power, who use it to cover up the darkest parts of their lives. It's a machine designed to crush anyone who dares to stand in its way, and I'm just one person. I don't have the resources or the connections to fight it, but that doesn't mean I'll stop trying. I've learned to be careful. I don't talk about that night. Not to my coworkers, not to my family, not to anyone. But I've started documenting everything, writing it all down in a notebook I keep hidden. It's my insurance, my way of making sure the truth doesn't die with me if something happens. Maybe one day someone will read it and decide to do what I couldn't. Maybe one day the truth will finally come to light. But until then, I'm stuck in this limbo, haunted by what I saw and what I couldn't do. The screams are the worst part. They don't come every night, but when they do, they feel like they'll never stop. I can hear them in my dreams, echoing through the dark halls of that mansion, growing louder and louder until I wake up in a cold sweat. I've started sleeping with the lights on, as if that will somehow keep them at bay. It doesn't. I think about that basement a lot, about the things we found there and the things we didn't. I wonder how much was destroyed in the fire, how many secrets were reduced to ash before we even arrived. And I wonder about the things we didn't see, the rooms we didn't find, the doors we didn't open. What else was hidden in that house? What else did they bury? Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever know the full truth. Other times, I'm afraid of what I might find if I keep digging. The mansion is gone now, reduced to rubble and cleared away like it was never there. But the people behind it, the ones pulling the strings, they're still out there, still walking free, still hiding behind their money and influence, still silencing anyone who gets too close. And the worst part is, they'll probably get away with it, because that's how the system works. It protects the powerful and punishes the rest of us for daring to ask questions. The greatest charity. I don't know what comes next. Some days I think about taking the photos to someone who can actually do something about them. Other days I think about burning them, about letting it all go and trying to move on. But every time I get close to making a decision, I hear those screams again. I see her face, and I know I can't turn my back on this, no matter how much it costs me. If you're reading this, I hope you understand. The world isn't what it seems. The people you admire, the ones you see on magazine covers and red carpets, they're not who you think they are. Behind the glitz and glamour, there's darkness. There are secrets they don't want you to know, things they'll do anything to keep hidden. I don't have all the answers. I probably never will. But I know one thing for sure. The truth is out there, buried under layers of lies and corruption. And if you ever find yourself standing on the edge of it, staring into the abyss, don't turn away. Don't let them win. The screams still haunt me. I think they always will. But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's a reminder that some things are too important to forget, too important to bury, and too important to ignore.